Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Meghan Bedsted, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and our partner, the Cambridge Public Library, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this evening's event with Laurence Tribe and Joshua Matz, discussing their latest book to end a presidency, The Power of Impeachment. I'd like to take a moment to say thank you for buying books from Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases not only support this author series, but they also ensure the future of a beloved independent bookstore, so we thank you. And as a reminder, we do ask that you please silence your cell phones for the talk. And now I'm going to turn it over to Senior Librarian Drew Griffin from the Cambridge Public Library to introduce tonight's speakers.
Some months back, I was on Twitter, something I seem to do a lot these days. I follow Professor Tribe, one of his 337,000 followers. As I remember, he retweeted a painting of a large oak tree with the comment that oaks are great, but beech trees are the best. I don't know if you remember this. Well, as you all know, we have a rather impressive beech tree adorning the front of our library here. So I replied to him, "You like beech trees, Mr. Tribe? We have a beautiful one at the Cambridge Public Library where we would love to have you speak." And I put in my email address. He never responded. I'm sure when you have 337,000 followers, you get all kinds of strange requests. A few weeks later, I was walking out of the library with our director, Maria McCauley, and I recounted this story to her. After laughing at my temerity, she expressed interest in having Professor Tribe speak at the library. We arranged a meeting with our outstanding communications team. We sat down, and our communications director, Zoe Del Mar, eagerly said, "Drew, you know Laurence Tribe?" "No, not at all," I responded. "But I do follow him on Twitter." Her look was priceless. Muna Kangson, the other half of the communications team, jumped in and offered to call up Mr. Tribe. We then discovered that Harvard Bookstore wanted to bring Mr. Tribe in for his new book. So here we are, a real group effort with Mr. Tribe and Joshua Matz, his co-author, to discuss To End the Presidency, The Power of Impeachment. Laurence Tribe is the Carl M. Loeb University Professor and Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard University. He is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, has been a member of the U.S. Supreme Court Bar since 1978, has served on various governmental commissions, and is the recipient of 11 honorary doctorates. He is the author of American Constitutional Law, The Standard Book in the Field, and 11 other books, the last two of which have been written with Joshua Matz. Mr. Matz is a graduate of University of Pennsylvania, Oxford University, and Harvard Law School. He is of counsel at Gupta Westler and Kaplan & Company, and is the publisher of TakeCareBlog.com. To End the Presidency explores in detail the role of impeachment in our government, both from a historical perspective and in light of today's critical discussions. It has received glowing reviews from both sides of the aisle. Richard Painter, Chief Ethics Counsel for President George W. Bush, calls it the definitive book on how to end the national nightmare. Ganesh Sitaraman in The Guardian lauds the book as terrific, accessible, and thoughtful. And in The Atlantic, David Frum praises its clear-eyed and clear-thinking message. Please join me in welcoming Laurence Tribe and Joshua Matz to the Cambridge Public Library.
Thanks very much, and thank you all for being here. I want to thank the Harvard Bookstore and the Cambridge Public Library, and I especially want to thank Joshua Matz, a fantastic co-author. I wouldn't have written 2 books with him if I didn't think that. Also, the most amazing human being and student and research assistant that I've had since Barack Obama in 1989. I don't...
Larry, you're going to make me blush.
You're blushing a little, Joshua. No, he's been an enormous pleasure to work with, a great colleague, and a great intellectual and emotional resource. I was thinking back to when I was Joshua's present age. That's why I asked you if you were 32 almost, or whatever. To be 32. Well, when I was his age, Watergate was raging. I had just gotten tenure at Harvard, but nobody knew who the hell I was. So I just watched the spectacle from afar. I had views, but I wasn't able to get an audience of any kind. So I feel incredibly privileged that if I get an idea now, even if it's an idiotic one, I'm able to sort of test it out, not only on my amazing students, and I've had plenty of them, but on a somewhat larger world. Anyway, Watergate was my introduction to presidential impeachment. It looked at the time like a practical way to prevent a crooked president from wrecking our constitutional system. It was not going to be easy. It was obviously not easy until the very end when Goldwater and others came to Nixon and said the jig is up. He really was going to stick it out. That experience made clear that even a successful impeachment, and I regarded one in which the president resigns without having to go through the ordeal of a grand inquest, a trial, as one way an impeachment can succeed. Even a successful impeachment would put the country through a traumatic time. And so I was writing about impeachment. I wrote a good bit about it in my treatise on constitutional law in the first edition in 1978. But I hadn't formulated too many views about it because I hadn't deeply immersed myself in the history the way we have in writing this book. Certainly, as we began the book, we looked back and we noticed all kinds of intriguing things that Joshua will also speak about. There was an impeachment resolution that was particularly interesting, introduced against Ronald Reagan in the House in 1983, describing his invasion of Grenada as a high crime and misdemeanor. And on that occasion, the mayor of New York, then Mayor Koch, called the author of that resolution, Ted Weiss, the conscience of any room that he entered. There were times, said Koch, that I thought he would impeach God. But if he ever did, and this was the sort of the high point of his observation, you would know that he was intellectually honest. You knew that he thought God should be impeached. And that was clear. He wasn't just pulling a stunt. Anyway, he never got around to God, as we explain in our book. Instead, he had to settle for Reagan. And throughout the book, we try to sort of pepper what is actually a rather dismal and depressing subject with moments of levity that will keep people from deciding that they would rather set it aside for a better day. There was, of course, you all remember, I suspect, the entirely partisan impeachment of Bill Clinton in 1998 for lying under oath about sex. It was a crime, no doubt, not the sex, the lying, but it was not an abuse of presidential power. And as you'll see when you read the book and when Joshua kind of takes you through a quick tour of it, it is the abuse of presidential power that is the linchpin of a high crime and misdemeanor. In fact, when I have arguments with some of my former colleagues like Alan Dershowitz, when he says, but the president has the power to pardon, he has the power to hire and fire in the executive branch. My typical response, and the book elaborates it, is that's exactly why the abuse of that power is an impeachable offense. If the president, is convicted of tax evasion or something else, which has nothing to do with his powers as president, you're not in impeachment territory. Impeachment territory deals with abuse of power, both historically and functionally and in terms of the structure of the Constitution. Of course, in that case, the fact that it was purely partisan led it to fizzle and fail rather than succeed as with Nixon. In Nixon's case, there were some upstanding Republicans in a democratically controlled legislative body who came to him and did, as I say, tell him that his removal was a virtual certainty, and he was someone with a sense of shame. When you have a president with no sense of shame, as well as no moral compass, figuring out how to get him to leave without a national explosion is quite a challenge. Probably all remember, too, that the Senate acquitted Clinton. There were 55 votes to acquit and 45 to convict on the count of perjury. On obstruction of justice, the vote was 50 to 50, but it would have taken 67 to remove him from office. And the net result, after all of that, was that his popularity soared. That is, the fact that a bipartisan coalition had not been formed was itself enough for the country to react negatively against the failed impeachment effort. Well, fast forward to the present. In the election of 2016, something I like not to think too much about, but that I do have to occasionally recall, in the election of 2016 between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, we really had the first election in American history in which partisans on both sides were convinced ultimately that if their candidate lost, the winner should be impeached immediately. It didn't matter what more one learned. Each side was convinced that the other was stealing the election. I think one side with more justification than the other. But it was a conviction deeply held by tens of millions of people on both sides. And I have to admit that I tilted in that direction back in the day. That is, I really didn't, I have to admit, and this will not make me seem like much of a prophet, I didn't contemplate the possibility that the American people, either directly or through the cockamamie Electoral College, would actually put someone like Donald Trump in the position of President of the United States. And I did think, right from the start, if he becomes president, the first thing on my agenda was going to be to see how I could prevent the thing from going on very long. Boy, was I wrong. I guess you can clap if you want, but I was wrong. For one thing, the more one was committed to getting rid of the man from the beginning, the less credibility one would have when the evidence piled up and one said, this amounts to a high crime and misdemeanor. Well, you thought that at the very beginning, people would say. That said, I wasn't in a group with people like Tom Steyer who thought, we must impeach him now. I mean, I was, I think, sensible enough to know that that could backfire. Saw what happened with Clinton. But I was part of the group that said we must begin to work on impeachment now. We must begin investigating now. I imagined that both the House and the Senate, despite the hyper-partisan environment, would take seriously an inquiry into whether the election was effectively stolen, not just by Jim Comey with his misjudgments, honest though he is, but by a foreign adversary, that people would not stand for it, especially the Republican Party, which had spent a lot of time sort of demonizing the Reds, the communists, the former USSR. They, I thought, wouldn't stand for it. Obviously, I was wrong. There was a turning point for me, and this turning point encompasses some things that are in the book and some that are just after. On May 9th, Comey was fired. Almost immediately, the president said to Lester Holt on national TV, it was the Russia thing. This was a rare case in which you didn't need to find a smoking gun hidden in a drawer. The smoking howitzer was sort of right out there. On May 13th, I had an op-ed in the Washington Post saying that we have to start investigating impeachment now, both because of the corruption that the president refused to avoid by getting rid of his ownership of his assets. That he was going to be a magnet for money from foreigners, foreign countries, foreign governments, in violation of the until then, very little known emoluments clause. It was something that people thought was referred to some pharmaceutical product, a hand lotion or something. Well, I think now most people know what it is, and he's been in violation of it from the very start. But as you'll see when you get to that part of our book, we don't think it's so clear that that violation is in itself an impeachable offense. In fact, we put a lot of attention into the way in which patterns of abuse of power, like kleptocracy on the whole, might be a better way of capturing the idea of a high crime and misdemeanor than a particular constitutional violation. I mean, after all, if presidents were removable every time they violated the Constitution or were found to have violated it by the Supreme Court, no president since FDR would have remained in office very long. They all violate the Constitution from time to time, partly because it's a hell of a difficult document to interpret, and there are many different views of it, and partly, as now, because there are some presidents who don't give a damn what it says and probably don't understand it. But a constitutional violation, I mean, if that were enough to remove a president, we explain in the book, how many courts would ever dare find that a particular presidential act violated the Constitution? We may well, although we won in the lower courts, Joshua and I and others who litigated against the terribly bigoted anti-Muslim travel ban, we may well lose that one in the US Supreme Court. But the odds of losing it would be higher still if the court thought that a 5-4 ruling against the president would spell immediate impeachment and removal from office. Anyway, on May 17th, just 4 days after I wrote that op-ed, Rosenstein installed special counsel Mueller, whom he would supervise because Jeff Sessions had recused himself from all matters relating to the campaign and also Russian involvement in it. And that was, for me, the turning point. When Mueller was gone, I thought, we now have no choice but to gear up the impeachment machinery, however counterproductive it might be. But when Mueller was put in place, I thought, well, now we can at least get a full development of the evidence while we, as a nation, debate and think about the pros and cons of removing this guy. And as Joshua will also explain, it's by no means obvious that if you could just wave a magic wand and be rid of him, that the world would be better off, or that our democracy would be better off. What about all the people who would think the election had been stolen? How many would go to the streets with pitchforks or the modern equivalent? The underlying conditions of malaise and democratic dysfunction and polarization exacerbated by social media that had led to his election wouldn't immediately vanish. They would still be there. And we decided that a real point of our book, though I don't want to require too much of a spoiler alert, was less the virtue of removing a president, ending a presidency, than the importance of preserving a democracy. That was really the point, and one needed to proceed in a way that would do that. Well, as we wrote at feverish speed, events were even faster. I mean, one of the things that makes it easier for this fellow to survive is that before you've really absorbed the enormity of one thing he's done wrong, there are 3 more the next day. Wait a minute, was this the one that was fired? Was that the tweet that sort of sank 1,000 ships? Well, in the run-up to the election, we had already thought, and it turns out that intelligence communities of the United States had concluded that there were people in the Trump campaign who were working directly with Putin to help Trump get elected. Simple as that. We still don't know exactly what role Trump himself played in that and what he knew and when he knew it. A perennial question. We talk in the book about whether what he did before becoming president could be an impeachable offense. I think Joshua will talk about that. I'm doing this.
I just want to say right now, I'm not talking about all these things, but
All right.
you're welcome to ask questions about them during the Q&A.
Yeah, that's actually the question period. The question period is the best. I say that as it's kind of like clearing your voice, like, yeah, well. No, it's an unfair burden, one that I'm not taking on and one that I easily shuffle off. There were a lot of post-election abuses of power about which Joshua will not talk. The pardon of the infamous Joe Arpaio, both an abuse in itself, despite the fact that the president has pardon power, and part of an overwhelming net of obstruction of justice, of which there are dozens of instances now, and they mount every day. A couple of days ago, when the president said, "I hereby order the Justice Department to investigate my investigators." That was just staggering. People don't typically have the right to demand that the police investigate somebody. And they don't acquire that right simply by being president of the United States, unless the president is a king and is above the law. Kleptocracy on steroids, that's going on all the time. His whole family. If you try to track our policy with respect to particular countries, like Qatar or Iran, there's just too much to be a coincidence. Qatar says to Jared Kushner, "We're not going to bail you out of this idiotic $1.6 or $1.3 billion investment at 666 Fifth Avenue." And suddenly we start siding with the Saudis on the blockade of the Qataris. And then they turn around and say, "Yeah, maybe Jared will help you after all." And suddenly the president says, "That blockade wasn't so important after all." There are thousands of examples that show that this president is using the office to enhance his wealth. And it's not that I'm particularly jealous of his wealth, it's that I think that the president is supposed to be, last time I looked, preserving the interests of the United States and not the interests of the Trump organization. And when the policies of the United States on Ukraine, on the Magnitsky Act, on sanctions against various countries, track not the interests of this country, but the interests of this guy who is infinitely greedy, then we really have a problem. I could go on and on, but I won't. As long as Rosenstein is in place, and Mueller and the Southern District of New York are pursuing the truth, the downside of pursuing impeachment may well exceed the upside. It's a close question. Our book is about navigating the shoals between Scylla and Charybdis. No matter what we do, having put this guy in power, we're screwed. But I think we'll survive. We've endured other crises before. We've endured the Civil War, but a different country, a better one after it. If we endure this period, we will, I think, be a different country. But will we be better or worse? Will we have learned our lesson, never again to elect someone like this, perhaps to get around the Electoral College? Or will we have gotten so used to this kind of collapse of democratic institutions that it will seem easier the next time around? And that would be a great tragedy. Anyway, if you want to learn more about this and get a signed copy of the book, after the Q&A period, I invite you to get a book, and I'd be happy to sign it, and Joshua would as well. Thanks very much, and now the person on whom I've loaded all of this, Joshua Matz.
Well, so I come to you with the weight of these terrible expectations. I wore my best Superman shirt for the occasion. I was told before I got up here by the guy who owns the bookstore that our main goal is to persuade you all to buy books. It's not obvious to me that that is my main goal, but I just thought I would let you all know that we would be grateful if you would buy them, because I think they're pretty good, and they'll give you a much better sense of what we think than just this conversation here. So hopefully this is a chance to just give you the big picture and where we're coming from. And I want to start right now by saying I'm not going to talk very much about Trump over the next 5 to 10 minutes. I suspect many of you would love to talk about him. I suspect many of you would be interested in hating on him and sort of me going on about all the ways in which he's acting terribly and illegally. And I think he is doing those things. I just want to step back and talk a bit more about the book and where we're coming from. And then in the Q&A, we'd be happy to dive more into current events and how we see the book relating to that. Because for me, in coming to the book, Larry had approached me. He had this idea, so like impeachment. I think it's going to be big. And he was right, as he usually is. And he said, I think I want to write a book about impeachment that has something to do with this administration. And my very first question is, and on what planet are you going to publish a book on this administration that isn't outdated within 3 months? Tell me how that looks. And so we had a long conversation, and one of the big questions that we really agreed was important is how do you describe this constitutional power, its legal dimensions, its historical and political dimensions, in a way that is relevant today, but that will also be relevant in 5 years and in 10, and that offers a framework for how to think about this that people with different beliefs can apply to their own circumstances. And ultimately, that is what we aimed to do. And for me in particular, the question that animated the book was, let's imagine that you think this guy is a bastard. Let's imagine that you think he is terrible, that he's breaking the law, that he's breaking norms, that he's violating core premises of American democracy. And let's imagine that 40% of the country wants to impeach him and 60% doesn't, which is the world in which we find ourselves. What do you do next? Loading public discourse with impeachment talk and, calling for that extreme remedy right off the bat and mobilizing an entire movement around that idea may or may not be the best way to deal with a president who you believe is out of control. And so it seemed to me that the real question is, how do you build a political consensus necessary to thwart the president? And once that exists, what kind of a conversation do you have about the appropriate response to wrongdoing? And is calling for impeachment the best rhetorical strategy, the best political strategy for getting the country to a place where it can really deal with the damage this guy is doing? And so if you were going to approach it that way, we thought that there are basically 6 questions you have to ask. And those are the 6 questions that structure our book. And I'll just very quickly run through it. This will be the rough equivalent of me summarizing the preface, but the preface is far more articulate than I am, so I encourage you to take a look at that. The first chapter is, what is this power? Why does it exist? Why did the framers put it here? And in telling that story, we start with Benjamin Franklin at the Constitutional Convention, who got up and he said, you guys, we have a real problem here. We're creating this new powerful federal government and this new position, a president. But historically, when powerful leaders of powerful governments got out of control, there was basically only one thing to do about it, and that was assassination. How do we avoid a historical pattern of coup and revolution and assassination as the way that countries deal with leaders who go off the rails? And he had an idea. He said, there's this English doctrine of impeachment. It was centuries old. It had basically fallen into disuse in England, but it had been received into the colonies. And he said, I think we can do something with this. I think we can make it work for us. Obviously, we're going to have to make some changes. In England, you could not impeach the king. That would be in some tension with the idea that the king was above the law and was chosen by God. And by some tension, I mean, obviously you couldn't do that. And also there was this question of what is the standard for impeachable conduct going to be and what is the manner in which we're going to do it. And those were questions the framers very quickly realized they'd have to grapple with. But the first and most basic question they had to decide was whether to include an impeachment power in the Constitution. And it may seem obvious to us that you would want to do that, but quite a few framers didn't think it was obvious at all. And in the first chapter, we chart the history of the impeachment power, the manner in which it was Americanized, the way in which they constructed it, and the debates that the framers had among themselves over whether we should have it and why we should have it, and what kinds of presidential wrongdoing in particular might evoke the need to activate it. And we'd offer that not because we think that the framers' word is final. In fact, Larry and I think very much the opposite. The Constitution belongs to the living. But understanding the original plan can at least offer us guidance in thinking about how is this power meant to relate to the broader system of checks and balances, and under what circumstances should we use it. And in the rest of Chapter 1, we walk through a number of impeachment efforts in history, including that against President Tyler, who was nearly impeached in the 1840s for vetoing a ton of bills that Whigs in Congress passed, and they just lost their minds and were like, we have to get rid of this guy. And their impeachment effort failed, although narrowly. We then talk about Nixon and Clinton and try to extract from these a few basic principles, many of which Larry identified. And those principles are roughly as follows. You can't impeach the president for every unconstitutional act, because, as Larry pointed out, that would create overwhelming, crushing pressure on the constitutional system, which leaves many difficult questions unanswered and forces us to find answers in our own time. Moreover, you can't just look to the constitutional hardware, as it were. You also have to look to the software. What are the norms that define acceptable governance? What are the norms that give us an understanding of what it means to be the president of a democracy? And if a president violates those, that may well constitute grounds for impeachment, that you have to look to the full scope of the threat that the president's behavior poses to the country. And finally, we warn that you can't have partisan impeachments, and they're the Clinton cases, the lodestone, but you also don't want to set the bar too high. There's a temptation to say, well, Watergate was such an easy case. That is sort of the canonical picture of impeachment. But the framers knew that threats to the republic could come in many forms. They could come from crooks or kleptocrats. They could come from high-functioning morons. And in any number of circumstances, you need to be ready to deal with a president who is unwilling to abide the constitutional system. So that leads us to the second chapter, to what is often presented as the only question. And I'm sure you've all seen 1,000 articles of the following form. The president has or has not committed a high crime and misdemeanor. Insert Madison quote here. Therefore, he must or must not be impeached. End of story. Right? The usual way in which impeachment is talked about reduces the entire thing to a single question. Is what the president did a high crime and misdemeanor? If so, the sword of Damocles has to fall, the trigger has to go, out with the president, and that's the only question worth asking. We think that that is the exact wrong way to think about impeachment. The question whether the president has committed treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, and therefore has made impeachment constitutionally permissible, is not the same thing as knowing whether Constitution is wise or prudent or even possible. But nonetheless, it's important to know. What is a high crime and a misdemeanor? Under what circumstances is impeachment constitutionally allowed? And we talk at some length about that question. A lot of folks like to say, as Gerald Ford did during an effort under the Nixon administration to impeach Justice Douglas, that high crimes and misdemeanors just mean whatever the House says they mean. And that's true in the most uninteresting, cynical sense. One that doesn't care about constitutional structure and in which Congress can impeach for any arbitrary reason that strikes its fancy. But we contend in the book that you can draw on constitutional text and principle and structure and lessons of American history to give content to this idea. And it's not that impeachable offenses are only things that are federal crimes. It's not that a pattern of conduct can amount to impeachment. And these are 2 points that have been widely disputed, and we think the answer is pretty clear, and we explain why. The bottom line is impeachable conduct occurs when the president abuses his power or otherwise acts in a manner that makes him unviable as the leader of a country that is a democracy. Is he using his power corruptly or tyrannically, or is he otherwise engaged in conduct that really makes it unthinkable that we will persist in a shared democratic project together with that individual at the helm? And to go on knowing that we allowed someone who did those things to continue to exercise that kind of power. And so we talk at great length about the meaning of bribery and treason and how they can inform the meaning of high crimes and misdemeanors, and offer some really wonderful historical examples, one of which I'll just briefly note here. I assume that many of you have seen or heard of Hamilton, the absolutely awesome Lin-Manuel Miranda musical. Now, it's kind of, the musical ends where, no spoilers, but like this was the 17th, it was a while ago. So the musical ends where Vice President Burr has killed former Treasury Secretary Hamilton, and everyone is sad and they cry, and then the curtain closes. And you think, like, golly, that was really moving. What happened next? The Vice President of the United States just straight up murdered somebody who also happened to be a framer and a former Treasury Secretary. Could you imagine if Mike Pence shot and killed Scott Mnuchin? And everyone was just like, oh, okay. Like, dueling happens. I guess it's rough out there in Washington, or in that case, in Weehawken, New Jersey, which may still be rough, I don't know. So, as we point out, Burr was never impeached. And not only was he not impeached, but when charges were issued against him for murder in New York and New Jersey, a number of senators wrote to the governors of those states and said, we would be most grateful if you would drop the charges, because this is enormously embarrassing to us, the Senate, because the vice president is also the president of the Senate, and it looks terrible for him to have these indictments hanging over his head. And so the charges were dropped, and then it gets even weirder. After the charges are dropped, Burr returns to the Senate to preside over the partisan impeachment of Justice Salmon, creating, as one commentator at the time remarked, an unusual scenario in which the murderer was not arraigned before the judge, but the judge was arraigned before the murderer. And so here you have a circumstance in which the clearest possible crime is committed, and yet not only does the Senate not impeach, it begs these states to drop their indictments and doesn't even consider the possibility of impeachment. And we use that story to motivate a much broader explanation of the relationship between impeachments and crimes, the bottom line of which is that not all crimes are impeachable and not all impeachable offenses are crimes, and ultimately we can't escape responsibility for judgment. That ultimately what the Constitution asks from us is judgment. Is this the kind of conduct that makes this person unviable as the leader of a democracy? And who exactly is it that makes that determination? Well, here we arrive in the third chapter, Congress. It's Congress that ultimately makes this determination. And there are many, many implications of this. The first of which we think has been drastically underappreciated, is that Congress, in addition to having the power to impeach, has the power not to impeach. That nowhere does the Constitution establish the House or the Senate as a roving commission to smite all wrongdoers. There is no deus ex machina clause in the Constitution. Congress, as in so many other areas, has the discretion, and in particular the House has the discretion, to decide should we come after the president. And that discretion operates at every level of the process. It operates at figuring out whether to investigate, whether to use the I word in public, whether to form a special committee to investigate, whether to authorize that committee to consider articles of impeachment, all the way up to a final House vote on whether to actually impeach the guy. And then, of course, the discretion flows to the Senate. And there have been senators in US history, including Senator Robert Byrd in the Clinton impeachment, who said, I believe that he is guilty of the high crimes and misdemeanors alleged, and I will nonetheless vote to acquit, because I don't think impeachment is in the greater interest of the Republic. So Congress enjoys extraordinary discretion in deciding whether and when and how to investigate conduct that may be impeachable, to bring it to the public's attention, to go after the president. Congress, of course, doesn't just have the impeachment power. It can censure the president. It can use the power of taxation of the purse. It can pass laws. It can investigate. It can engage in oversight. Congress has an arsenal of tools that allow it to respond to a president who's out of control. Impeachment is the biggest and most powerful, but also the most dangerous of them. So in thinking about what Congress should do in the face of presidential wrongdoing, the question isn't just, did Madison somewhere say that conduct sort of like this is a high crime and a misdemeanor? The question is, what is the right move to save our democracy in the face of what the president has done here? And Congress has to make that decision, and it has lots of tools available to it, and it has to choose among them. And in the third chapter, not only do we describe those tools, but we offer a general framework. And I actually personally think this is one of the most interesting parts of the book, although, of course, it's all great. But in this part of the book, we divide it up and we say, what are the risks of impeaching too soon? What are the risks of impeaching too late or not at all? And what risks are unavoidable, even if you get it exactly right? And we really try to offer a comprehensive framework of all of the things that you ought to think about in deciding whether and when to pull that trigger. This leads us to the fourth chapter, where we go deeper into the halls of Congress. We're a little obsessed with Congress because usually when people write about impeachment, they just say, like, legal scholars are like, oh, we're really good at interpreting what high crimes and misdemeanors are, and the rest is politics. And they dismiss politics as though it's uninteresting. Well, we don't quite see it that way, / we think that's an exceptionally stupid way to write about it. And so we really take that seriously. And in Chapter 4, go deep into the halls of Congress. The Constitution doesn't tell Congress how to do an impeachment. It doesn't tell it what the process is, except with the barest of outlines. It doesn't really explain how things should work, whether what the burden of proof should be, whether witnesses should be allowed, whether lawyers should be allowed. All these very important questions that can define what an impeachment really looks like. So in Chapter 4, we return to the Constitutional Convention and we ask, why did the framers give this to Congress? They carefully considered giving it to the Supreme Court. They also considered giving it to a council of all state governors, to a council of all state legislatures, and to a council of all of the highest justices of each state Supreme Court. Like, they left no stone unturned. Every branch of government that exists in the Constitution at one point in the convention wielded the impeachment power. And they ended up giving it to Congress, but then splitting it and giving half of it to the House and half of it to the Senate. Why did they do that? I will not tell you, but it's in the book. It's in Chapter 4. And I promise you it's very interesting. And then they imposed a supermajority voting requirement in the Senate, which was almost unprecedented in the history of Western constitutionalism. But they did it there and in a number of other places, including the 25th Amendment, foreshadowing. They did it in the 25th Amendment because this was the kind of thing that they needed to be damn sure the country had thought hard about. There needed to be deliberation and there needed to be some level of consensus. And so going from there in Chapter 4, we describe in detail how an impeachment works, how it starts, what the process is, what every stage of it looks like, what factors Congress historically has and hasn't considered significant. And we end by looking at all of the major impeachment efforts in history and giving a general account of what factors tend to make it more likely that Congress will impeach and won't impeach. And obviously that may be of some interest to those of you trying to figure out those odds today. That leads us to Chapter 5, and I'll move very quickly so we have lots of time for Q&A. In Chapter 5, we do something a little different. We step way back and we ask, why is it that there is so much darn impeachment talk in modern American politics? It's easy to take for granted. I kind of did. I'm like young enough that I can, my entire life in politics, we've talked about impeachment. When I first told my grandparents that I was writing this book, one of them said to me, it's the funniest thing. I just don't recall that being something that we talked about until the mid to late 1990s. It just wasn't there in our political discourse. And Larry and I go back all the way to Washington and offer a comprehensive history of every impeachment resolution ever introduced in the House and of every major national political campaign in which impeachment was prominently featured. And first of all, it's an incredibly interesting tale because these are some very colorful, very interesting people. It's also interesting because it points up the oddity of our own era. There was an early wave of impeachment talk stretching from about Thomas Jefferson through about Andrew Johnson. It trickles down, surges up under Andrew Jackson, basically disappears from the 1860s until Truman. And then when Harry Truman fires General Douglas MacArthur, everyone went bananas. And there was impeachment talk everywhere. It was very exciting. It was on the cover of all the newspapers. There's a huge wave of it then, a wave a year later in 1952 in relation to steel seizure, and then it disappears again essentially until Nixon. And then it disappears again really until Iran-Contra, with a brief exception in 1983 for the invasion of Grenada. And then from Clinton forward, unrelenting impeachment talk. Every president has faced numerous credible calls for their impeachment in the press and in Congress. Under Bush and Obama, by their 6 years, 30% of the public supported impeaching both of those presidents, which is an extraordinary figure if you think about it. I mean, Trump started at 40 and has essentially persisted there, which is interesting. There hasn't been a ton of movement on that number. But that idea that impeachment is an ordinary part of political rhetoric and political opposition is a new thing. And it's a development that we think is underappreciated and that we think has changed the politics of impeachment in a really major way, because it has turned impeachment from this massive, in case of emergency, break glass measure to save our democracy into a run-of-the-mill weapon in our partisan civil war. which means that when people hear impeachment talk, they're more skeptical of it, they're more inclined to view it as yet another instance of hyper-partisan combat, they're less inclined to think that it means something real. In some respects, we're trapped in a giant boy who cries wolf dilemma around impeachment talk. And so we warn that ultimately, in the long run, a superabundance of impeachment talk in the way that we think about politics will probably do more harm than good. That it will supercharge forces of cynicism and partisanship and tribalism with little countervailing benefit. And it may actually inure to the benefit of presidents who abuse their power. Because as we've seen, Bush, Obama, and Trump have all done this. They use impeachment threats to rally their base. And so that existential character of impeachment talk has generally helped rather than hindered presidents at a moment in history where the last thing we need is to give presidents more ways to defy political accountability. And this leads us to our sixth and final chapter in the book, where we ask a very simple question. Can the impeachment power achieve its purpose in a world of broken politics? Because that's the world we live in. And if you're going to talk about a power like this that is so deeply sunk in how our political dynamics work, you have to ask about that. The impeachment clause essentially places a wager on the American people. It wagers that presidential wrongdoing that genuinely threatens our democracy will arouse forces, bipartisan forces of opposition, strong enough to overcome apathy and inertia and partisanship and all of the other things that get in the way of political action. Can we do that anymore? Is that possible? We end on a hopeful note, but the final chapter goes deep into that. We talk at some length about all of the various dysfunctions that currently ail our democracy. We have a lengthy discussion of the 25th Amendment, which we frankly view as an unwelcome and unproductive detour from a conversation that needs to happen about whether the president is using his power appropriately. And we conclude by warning that partisans on both sides have been attracted to essentially a magical view of impeachment. That opponents of Trump think of it as a magic wand that will simply solve all our problems. It'll turn back time, it'll get rid of Gorsuch, it'll get rid of all his crazy foreign policy things, it will undo the damage that he's caused to our democracy. We get asked all the time, will it trigger a special election? Will Hillary automatically become president? I mean, people really think like you invoke impeachment and like time goes backward. Now, not only is that not true, and not only is it dangerous, because if you're trying to persuade people who don't agree with you to impeach, characterizing it as a revolution in American life may not be the way to go. It's also dangerous because I think it devalues other important forms of political engagement. And this idea that there's a Mueller miracle or an impeachment white knight that will charge into the scene and save us from all our problems is dangerous. And so we warn that in one part of the population, there's this conception of impeachment as this magic bullet that will save everything, and that's wrong. But on the other side, there's this sense that impeachment is a doomsday device, right? I mean, and like I personally think that the major doomsday device right now is Trump's Twitter account. But to his followers, impeachment is the thing that threatens to blow up everything that they have fought for. They finally, a group of people who think of themselves as voiceless and dispossessed, have their champion. And wouldn't it be something if those elites got him? Wouldn't it just prove them right? And that's a lot of people, some of whom are heavily armed. And you have to ask but I mean it, and you have to ask yourself a question. What happens if tens of millions of people believe that there has been an illegitimate coup in direct response to them finally have gotten a say in our democracy, as they might see it? So for them, impeachment is a doomsday device. We think that too goes too far. It is important to separate a particular person's abuse of power from a particular political movement having a voice in the halls of power. And so what we ultimately conclude is that what this moment calls for is judgment, and it calls for clarity, and it comes for everyone chilling out a little bit. Times are scary, things are bad, but the path forward is not going to be carved by waving a magic wand or triggering a doomsday device. We're going to find it by figuring out together how to use the institutions and powers of our democracy to save ourselves. And that's a conversation that you can't have if you're caught up on fantastical thinking that impeachment will make everything okay.
So we've got time for a couple questions. So if one of our speakers calls on you, I'll do my best to rush over and get you the mic.
Yeah, if you could always wait for the mic before
Sure.
speaking, that would help.
So you talk about, impeachment talk has been risen over the past 25 years. How much is it caused by the partisanship in Washington with people like Newt Gingrich becoming Speaker of the House? I guess it started then. And how much is it being driven by the politicization of media? The Fox News, Breitbart, Drudge, MSNBC. How much is it a cause and effect, or how do you see that?
Well, I guess we don't have a way of quantifying it. We do think that each of the things you mentioned is important. There's a kind of tribalism that has taken place. People select the news they want to hear. They believe what they want to believe. Now more people are upset if their kids marry outside their political tribe than if their kids marry outside their race or marry someone of the same gender. I mean, it's become sort of a way of completely splitting and dividing the polity. There are other factors, gerrymandering, sort of self-sorting demographically, a distance between representatives and those they represent, and money in politics is an important factor. I mean, certainly something that 90% of the people favor in terms of gun safety measures, you would think would at least get a vote in both houses, or at least one. But the power of the gun lobby and the gun manufacturing industry is overwhelming. It turns out that none of those things is easy to change. The gerrymandering thing, well, the Supreme Court finally took 2 cases, but neither Joshua nor I are particularly optimistic about what will happen. On the other hand, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania took a step under its own constitution that may be a harbinger of something positive. So there are a great many factors. But for me, one of the most positive ones that offsets a lot of this is the degree of activism and engagement at the grassroots of the Me Too movement and of the March 24th sort of Never Again movement, students uprising. That is, people rediscovering that we, the people, actually can have a voice, and that following a demagogue who says, I will be your voice, is not always the best way to activate them. But a lot of these movements take a lot of time to form, and one has to be patient. Back there? I think that's Irving, right?
Beg your pardon? Yes. I have sort of a 2-part question. First, given all these things that happen sort of on a daily basis that make one more against Trump, perhaps, than the day before, yet the polls seem to show that his overall approval rating is increasing. So how is that explainable? That's part 1 of the question. Part 2 of the question is relevant to the law of unintended consequences. Namely, if one successfully impeached Trump, there would be someone taking his place.
I think we have a sense of who that might be.
Say again? I didn't hear you.
We know who that might be. I mean, Mike
Yes.
Pence is no great shakes for most of us.
How do you deal with that possibility in your thinking on impeachment?
Well, I'll start by saying that I'm not going to answer your first question because I don't know the answer. And I'm not, I think there have been a lot of writings about why Trump's support is what it is. And maybe Larry will talk about those or maybe not, but that's not really sort of our expertise here. I think with respect to the second question, I mean, historically, people have thought a lot about who's going to take over. The idea that, you impeach the president and don't really care about who the vice president is has always been a non-starter. And so, for example, in the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, there were a lot of people at the time who thought that the reason that Johnson remained in office is that Benjamin Wade, who was the next in line had Johnson been impeached, was too radical and too progressive a Republican. And his colleagues couldn't bear the thought of putting him in there, and they thought that he would sink their chances in the upcoming election, whereas Ulysses S. Grant otherwise had a much better shot. Or when you look at Nixon, Nixon understood this. He actually said, I want to have a good insurance policy. And then his first insurance policy was indicted and had to resign. And so then he actually thought to himself, not great political judgment here, he thought, well, who can I pick who no reasonable congressman would put in charge of the country? And he picked Gerald Ford. And, as it turns out, Congress could live with that. But his effort, it kind of says something. It almost suggests that he should have been impeached. The kind of person who would seek to poison the well that way has such a disregard for the responsibility of the office. I don't know if Trump picked Mike Pence for that reason. I tend to doubt it. But I do think it's the case, at least according to the people who respond to me on Twitter and say as much, that the possibility of Pence getting installed is one reason to be cautious. I'm, for what it's worth, a little skeptical of that. I think there is daylight between Trump and Pence, and I think it's daylight that's worth caring about. Because in some ways it's the daylight between the unique singularity that is Trumpian democracy and an especially virulent right-wing version of existing establishment republicanism. And it's easy to just simply say they're all bastards, and it's easy to say Pence is tainted by association with everything that's happened under Trump, but we're not living in a world in which the Republican Party is going to suddenly become the Democratic Party. And recognizing the distinction between what's uniquely bad about Trump and what was bad but tolerable about existing Republican administrations matters, because ultimately that may be what we're aiming to go back to.
I would only add one thing, and that is that George Will recently has written an interesting piece arguing that Pence is vastly worse than Trump, that he is smarter, that he is more ideologically rigid, that he really does want to take control of women's bodies away from them, that he really does hate gay people, and that Trump doesn't give a damn as long as he does well himself. I don't take solace in that. I think the singularity that Joshua describes, the black hole, the soulless black hole that is represented by our current president, makes him uniquely, catastrophically, existentially distressing. And I would rather have an ideological right-winger who at least knows which end is up than someone like this who governs from the gut and the pocketbook. But that's a personal preference. I don't think that the view our book will at least try to persuade you of would lead you to think that if someone in every other respect ought to be removed because of the profound danger that that president poses to the whole system of government, that you should hesitate because you think some of the policy positions of the person who replaces the president will, for a time, be even worse.
And I would just emphasize one last thing, which is, the book doesn't really take strong positions on questions like that, because we're less concerned with sort of saying, here's how we think that you should think about these sort of specific questions. It's more about, for us, identifying that as an important question and identifying the key historical examples and the broader sort of way you might think about it, understanding that now and in the future, people will find their own answers and make their own judgments, but at least they should know what questions they're trying to answer.
And like Joshua, I won't try to answer your first question, because I find it unfathomable why his popularity keeps going up. Maybe I think that there's something about polls that sample only the surface, and that only kind of an extended dialogue in focus groups will lead one to have an understanding of how people are reacting to what's going on around them. Other questions? Yep.
Hi. I want to mention the idea about viability to run the republic as sort of a way to think about the case for impeachment. That relies on sort of an idea, like an interpretation of the Constitution's granted power of impeachment. And I'm curious, whether you think that's like a settled question within, or a settled idea within the minds of Congress, or if that's something that could be used for political purposes, and that people could argue, well, no, it's really just high crimes and misdemeanors, or switch back and forth to say, oh, maybe it is about viability.
Well, when I said the word viability, I was offering that as a partial, as one part of an interpretation of the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors. And I should say that we go into considerably more detail in chapter 2 of the book, and that you should take that rather than, you shouldn't believe anything I said today. You should just look at what we wrote, because there we had the chance to really think about it, and today we just said stuff. But what that idea is ultimately aiming at is, if you ask only about abuse of power, you may conclude that private conduct could in theory never be impeachable, but there's this sort of oddity of like, what if the president walks outside and literally murders 10 people on the front step of the White House? It's not per se an abuse of executive power, but it seems inconceivable that that individual would remain in office. Now, you could say there will inevitably be a follow-on abuse of power when he prevents an investigation into him, but that seems needlessly roundabout. And so what we're aiming at is essentially, or not what we believe the Constitution is aiming at, is abuses of power that are so extreme that they sort of threaten the viability of the democratic project, or other presidential conduct of the same order. And as to whether that's settled in the minds of Congress, I mean, gosh, who knows what's going on in their minds? But obviously, for them, it's a political judgment in many senses, and we like to hope that that includes a more statesman-like conception of political, in the classic and more noble sense of the term, and that they care about the country they're governing as opposed to merely their own short-term self-interest.
And in fact, much of what we have to say about things like that is more normative than descriptive. That is, like Joshua, I don't have a clue what's going on in the minds of some of these people who seem to have just sold out completely and don't seem to care about their oath to protect the country or anything of the sort. But it seems to me that having said that, it's important to have a general frame of reference. Our frame of reference tends not to be particularly formalistic. That is, a number of people writing about impeachment say that one prerequisite is that the conduct be engaged in while the president is in office. Anything done before that can't be a high crime and misdemeanor. But thought experiments are helpful. What if it's shown that the president bribed half the electors in order to become president? It's unthinkable that just because he didn't yet wear the crown when he did that you couldn't remove him from office on that basis. And we do engage in thought experiments of that kind to sort of test our intuitions about how one ought to think about some of these things.
Yeah, and actually, that hypothetical isn't just a hypothetical. Two framers said that at the convention. They said, what if he bribes the electors? And isn't it weird to think that if an incumbent president bribes the electors, he can be impeached because he's in office? But if someone first running for office bribes the electors, he can't be impeached because he did it while he wasn't in power yet.
Right.
I mean, like, there's a point at which, you spend too much time around lawyers and you begin to understand why there are all these jokes about them out there. And like, believe me, I get it. This is one of those times where we think that these were people creating a plan of government, not a sort of pretty philosophy experiment. And there are just circumstances in which you ask, would it really make sense to set a democracy up that way? And that those were questions that they were asking. And it's okay for us to ask them too.
Right. And speaking of lawyers, both of us are lawyers, but not in the pejorative sense.
And we've got time for one or two more.
Why don't you pick on somebody? Oh, okay.
How do you picture this whole thing playing out?
Well, so I spoke to Robert Mueller this morning.
And I spoke to Donald Trump.
My conversation was way more interesting. So there's a saying in Washington, D.C. that I heard a lot. I was a law clerk to Justice Kennedy a few years ago. And there's a saying around the Supreme Court, those who know don't talk, and those who talk don't know. And that's my answer to your question. I honestly wish that we knew. We could have written a 7th chapter that would have just been a barnstormer if we did. I think it's impossible to predict, in part because Trump is a walking chaos generator. And it seems like all the predictions that get made veer off in very unpredictable directions as soon as they're made. I think what it is safe, we can make a couple of very safe predictions. There will continue to be very strong impeachment sentiment among Democrats. Republicans, liberal Democratic representatives in some jurisdictions will continue to use that to mobilize their base and raise money. mainstream Democratic leaders in Congress will continue to oppose impeachment, and promise not to do it unless some extraordinary new evidence comes along. Republicans will use those impeachment threats to mobilize their base and will run ads saying that if the Democrat wins, it will make impeachment more likely, and that Democrats may, as a result, struggle in the midterms in some of the jurisdictions that they actually need to win to get control of the House and Senate, if impeachment is seen as one of the primary issues in play. And that's one respect in which a superabundance of impeachment talk in politics can actually inure to the benefit of the president, who is allegedly misusing his power.
So let me say a little bit about that. I also have no crystal ball. I didn't think he would win in the first place. But having said that, I actually do have something going on in my head about what might happen, and I might as well share it. I think that if Democrats, like Pelosi and others, succeed in tamping down impeachment talk and have more of an affirmative programmatic agenda and resist some of the sirens of the far left that I might find appealing but that might turn off too much of the electorate, that the Democrats will take over the House. That when they do take over the House, despite all of the counsel that one might provide, the temptation to impeach will be overwhelming. That he will be impeached, that he will then be acquitted. Because even if the Democrats take over the Senate, I just don't think there are going to be 67 senators to vote guilt. I think at that point, he will lord it over everybody, saying, look how I've been vindicated. I think then the odds of his being reelected in 2020, horrendous as that thought might be, go up considerably. And the thought of 8 years of this, I mean, I'm somewhat glad that at almost 77, I might not have to live through all of it. Those are my guesses. They're worth what you paid for them.
I would say this was a weird book to write because we both set out to write it in large part in reaction to Trump and in response to some of this early impeachment talk. And both of us, I think, changed our views quite significantly, as you're hearing in what we're saying, to a much, much more cautious view of how this will really play. And I think it's easy to feel frustrated and angry and to just be like, impeach the guy, hashtag impeachment. But when you actually play it all out, which is the responsible thing to do as citizens of a democracy, the game is a lot tougher than it may first seem.
And we could do one more. I'll let you pick.
And then you guys can come say hi to us after.
Right back there. No, I'm
Just
pointing to
talk.
this lady here.
Oh. Interruption.
Yeah, I was getting a little uncomfortable about that.
No, it's okay. Well, I think the basis of wanting to impeach is that we want somebody to be accountable for some things that were done very wrong by him. So is there in your book any part that talks about what else, if we calm ourselves about impeachment, is there anything else in the future that can be done to
Well, yeah,
hold
we
them
talk
accountable?
about, sure, I think Joshua's touched on some of them. It may seem rather empty, but a censure can make a big difference. There have been presidents who, upon being censured, felt completely sort of harassed by the Senate of the United States. I think the investigatory power, that is, if the power of subpoena moved from Devin Nunes to Adam Schiff, you would see an astonishing change. I mean, the public can be aroused to do all kinds of things if the information is released. I mean, the truth can help make us free. And I think the investigatory power, the power of oversight, is enormous. And I think the grassroots movement that I briefly mentioned, that can keep going if people register to vote, if the movements generate registration of high school students and kids who are going to be 18 at the next election or in 2020. So it's not as though we are suddenly paralyzed if he's not impeached. I mean, there's plenty that can be done.
And I think there's a bit of a trap there, right? Which is, it's kind of like impeach or nothing. And I now have the joy that I get to log on to Twitter once or twice a day, and like 5 people have tweeted at me you're an idiot, or you're a coward, or, how could you not think that this guy is serious enough? And I'm like, first of all, I sue Donald Trump for a living, and you tweet mean things at me. So I feel like I may actually get it a little bit. And second of all, there is the idea that impeachment is the only out because it's the only thing that seems big enough to the magnitude of the threat that he represents is itself part of the danger. That big threats don't always, like the fact that the other side broke a big rule doesn't mean that we should too. And I realize that there's a risk that it feels like fighting with one hand tied behind your back, or that it just seems like we're inadequate to the occasion. But Congress has a lot of powers, and it can use them in extraordinary ways. The entirety of Chapter 3 of our book goes through this in a lot of detail, and we show all the ways in which Congress can restrain a president short of impeachment. And figuring out if those will do the trick instead of an impeachment which has all these potentially dangerous consequences. Like, look, sometimes impeachment is justified. If and when that point comes, in my mind, I will happily say so. We're not there, and a large part of the country doesn't think we're there, which is itself one of the reasons we're not there. I mean, it's a little circular. But the idea of he is so bad that only impeachment will suffice is exactly the wrong way, in my view, to think about it.
And if Joshua gets 5 things a day saying, "What's the matter with you? Why aren't you for?" I mean, I get 500. It's kind of dispiriting to have so many people say, "We thought you were a liberal. What's the matter with you? Have you sold out? Are you really secretly working for Trump?" And here I'm
very secretly,
because the things I say about him are just gruesome. It seems to me, I'm a little surprised nobody's asked some other questions, maybe you will later, like, why not indict him? I certainly am not of the school, although Joshua may be, that a sitting president can never be indicted, no matter what. I'm not saying it's a great idea, but that's a possibility. There are all sorts of things that can be done to hold a president to account.
And you should come say hi to us and buy the book, and we'll sign it, and we don't want them to be mad at us. But come visit, come say hi.
Right.